I think Occupy is inspired by the red strand of May Day, going back to the Haymarket Martyrs and the Declaration of International Workers' Day out of that. But actually, there's a green strand that goes back into the Middle Ages all over the world. Remember the maypole? The spring holiday of how nature was fecund and life was good. And that's what people celebrated all around the world. The green strand's about our relation to nature. The red strand is about our relationship to each other. And we need to celebrate both. Woo! You know, back in the Middle Ages, the peasants were exploited, but they had 100 holidays. It wasn't the industrial capitalist grind that work became. And May Day was one of the central holidays. But as capitalism arose, and the capitalists needed people to work 12, 14, 16, up to 20 hours a day, work to death, they had to suppress that old green May Day. It was banned by the Puritans, but also resisted by the left wing of colonists around Thomas Morton and people like that who had a communitarian tradition, who said we're going to relate to the Indians, not slaughter them. We're going to relate to each other cooperatively, not be bow down to the so-called elect, you know, the people that supposedly had the right religion. And the same thing was going on in Britain as they industrialized. They tried to suppress May Day as a holiday because they wanted the discipline, they wanted to enforce scarcity. So by the time industrialism and capitalism developed, it was in the United States that the workers first demanded, the first labor unions were formed here in Philadelphia and New York. They demanded the 10-hour workday. And coming out of the Civil War, they formed the first national labor union, the NLU, the National Labor Union. They called for an 8-hour workday. And within a month, the International Working Men's Association, the so-called First International of the unions and the labor parties, called for the 8-hour workday. And that became the demand over the next couple of decades. We had very bloody strikes. And by bloody, I mean the bosses hired people to kill the strikers in 1877. So by 1884, the National Labor Union was now the American Federation of Labor. They called for, by May 1st, 1886, that we have the 8-hour workday. And that's what happened in Chicago at Haymarket. They had a demonstration. It was actually May 4th. And somebody threw a bomb in them, and then they blamed the demonstrators. And there was a trial. And 8 or 9 of the demonstrators who had led that demonstration were hung. And all they were doing is saying, we want an 8-hour workday. We don't want to be wage slaves. And out of that came the declaration, first by the AFL and then by the Second International Working Men's Association, of May Day, International Working Men's Day. And that began to be celebrated around the world as when workers would stand up and say, we want our rights. But it was associated with the radicals, the socialists and the anarchists. So after the Pullman strike, President Grover Cleveland, our buddy from Buffalo, declared that the Workers' Day will be Labor Day in September, and tried to divide us between the conservative labor bosses and the real workers' movement. And that fight continued. So when the second Red Scare, the McCarthyism in 1947, Congress passed a law saying May 1st is Loyalty Day. And you can go celebrate on Labor Day your workers' rights. So we're here today in a time when labor productivity since the 70s has grown up, has doubled, almost doubled. It's 80% since 1979. But our hourly wages are stagnant. Basically, they've declined a little bit. So all the increased stuff we produce is going to the 1%. So what if we shared that in terms of higher wages and free time? We could have 50% higher wages in a 6-hour workday by the math. So what they were demanding, what they celebrated in the Middle Ages, and what they began demanding in the Industrial Age is still relevant today. And we need to reclaim both traditions. We need to share the surplus product that we produce fairly, and we need to nurture nature that provides the basis of all productivity in the economy. Now, a lot of our work lately has been around tax reform. And if you know me, I ran for governor against Cuomo's austerity budget and regressive taxes. I just had an op-ed in the Post-Standard on how the schools don't have to be shut down, and Ida Benison Center doesn't have to be shut down, and the whole public service system doesn't have to be shut down because of a regressive tax system and the failure to share the revenues they promised with cities like Syracuse. So I'm all for tax reform, but we got to understand, if you want to deal with inequality, you're just throwing some change back at us after the inequality has been created. At the point of production, today, the AFL-CIO reported on this 2 weeks ago, or week before last, that CEOs make 380 times what the average worker does. The middle management people who, if you're a worker, that's who you really deal with on a day-to-day basis when you're fighting over working conditions and so forth, they make 2, 3, 4 times what the workers make. That's where inequality is generated. And if we don't deal with that, we're not dealing with the real problem of inequality. So we need tax reform and economic democracy. We need to remember the green tradition and the red tradition. And I think the kind of economic democracy we're talking about was said well by one of the Haymarket martyrs in his trial. And this is what he said. He said, "What is socialism or anarchism? Briefly stated, it is the right of the toilers to the free and equal use of the tools of production and the right of the producers to their product." You know, the right wing likes to talk about the government stealing the money they made with taxes. Well, the biggest theft in this society happens when you go to work. And you work for yourself about 4 hours, and then the capitalists take the other 4 hours of your work. That's where inequality is generated, and that's why we need a new system. And that's what Mayday is about.